Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Dulworth at Executive Networks. We're really pleased to have Professor Rob Cross here again with us today to talk about some really groundbreaking work that he's been doing over the last couple of years on the effectiveness of networks in organizations, both, personal networks and organization networks. As I've said in the past, Rob is, I think, one of my favorite professors because he both does incredibly rigorous academic research, but he also then works very, very hard to translate that research into practice for people like you, people that are members of our network, people out there in the world that could really use the insights and advice and guidance that come out of his research. He wrote a book, years and years ago called The Hidden Power of Social Networks, and then has been doing some really great research ever since then, and has actually a new book coming out this year or early next year. And this research that we're looking at today was funded partly by an organization called IRC4HR that Executive Networks has partnered with to bring some of this academic research, to a practical place and to publish it in a way that can be used by people, in organizations. So we're really thrilled to have this relationship with IRC4HR. And if you go to the handout section of the screen here of the right-hand table of contents on different aspects of interacting with this webinar, you'll see a handout on IRC4HR and then two handouts from Rob on this work that we're going to talk about today. And if you've been part of this, this is a series. This is a second in the series, and we'll have a third webinar with Rob coming up fairly soon, which we'll announce back out to all of you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rob. Good morning, Rob. How are you today?
Doing great, Mike. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank you for the chance to share this work, for introducing me to IRC4HR, and then obviously to IRC4HR themselves for helping to pull some of the results of this work out and make it accessible in a really unique fashion. This is a program of work I was doing for the research group that I direct around networks of successful people. And so what I did is I went out and isolated 20 companies, that really great firms. I won't mention the names of them, but top organizations in their field. And I said, could you give me 8 successful people you consider to be kind of in the upwardly mobile category, and they just, God forbid, look happy, right? And whatever measures I could get. I was interested in, are they performing well? But do you have other markers that, either the engagement scores of their people are doing well, or they're doing well physically, or it's just an observable idea. But the notion for me is to then focus in on very deep interviews with those 8 leaders, 4 women, 4 men, and see what's unique about how these highly successful people have managed connectivity throughout their career, both how they derive results through groups differently, how they manage influence with authority differently, and how they get greater impact from an innovation standpoint through the connections around them. And so, we had a massive amount of data that, with the help and funding of IRC4HR, we're able to help convert into some really neat lessons and ideas that we want to make accessible to people out there. So I would urge people to take a look at some of the handouts that are there. There are very concise lesson plans around what more successful people do, very specifically in this category of the work around innovation and how people differentiate themselves from an innovation standpoint. I will also stop a little bit midway and think about a poll. A couple of polls we'll do, but then also some diagnostic that we'll send out as well after this to give people another chance to interact with the results in a very specific way. We do want to make this interactive as possible, and so we're going to have a couple of structured polls in here to get thoughts around how organizations and leaders in organizations do things that create a context of trust and do things that create a context of purpose. But then I'm also interested in, as much as possible, fielding questions that come in over the chat feature at different points, or just engaging in a and concluding question around where do leaders in your organization excel by virtue of how they create energy around them? When they're under stress or pressure, where do you see leaders that do things that enable energy to get created in situations versus depleted? And so what led us down this path is really over 20 years of work now. I've worked with over 300 organizations. We've done the full broad network analytics over 1,000 times at this point. And in many of those places, I was capturing information on the performance of individuals from that organization. So it may be revenue production, it may be performance ratings, it could be patent counts, whatever I could get my hands on. And one of the things we incredibly consistently saw was that people that had broad networks perform better over time. Not a big network, but what I'll call a structurally diverse or a broad network with more bridging ties into other pockets of an organization. And number two, people that were energizers, people that created enthusiasm in networks around them tended to be statistically 4 times as likely to be in and stay in that high performance category as anything else we were seeing in terms of markers of individual expertise or other things like that. So we've seen these ideas play out, the broad network, early stage problem solving, and this idea of, if you create enthusiasm, it dramatically increases the odds that you become and stay a high performer over time. What I was interested in setting up these interviews was seeing, how do people do this? What do the projects of successful people look like, and how are they leveraging those networks? We could see it quantitatively through this first lens. We use the interviews to see it a little bit more qualitatively and understand how were people leveraging connections in a way that distinguish them. And from a broad network standpoint, what we found is there tend to be, 2, roughly speaking, categories of people. There's people that have new things land in their lap, number 8, when they already have 7 busy things going on, and they tend to hunker down and get the work done. Or there tend to be a category of person out there that when that thing comes along, they still create enough space to not just hunker down and do the work, but to reach out and see, are we thinking about this the right way? Am I involving the right people? Am I solving the right problem? And they had a much greater tendency to reach out to different areas of expertise. And as a product of that, they would win over time in a very, very invisible way, right? The people that do the work, to just hunker down and keep a more narrow network, they're not going to get fired, but the people that expand the network at that point have a much greater tendency to solve a bigger problem, to engage more people, to build a bigger reputation, and they win invisibly over time. Statistically, again, our work over 20 years shows that it's the second biggest predictor of a more successful person. So I would ask people in these interviews, can you identify 1, maybe 2 career-defining successes that you've had, and then tell me about, from beginning to end, how you leveraged your network in a way that made a difference for you and made that effort, career-defining success, significant. I wasn't interested in what they did. Now, everybody loved to tell me stories about what they did. I had to constantly pull them back to the network. But what you found, if you kept doing that and pushing people to think not about what did you do as the hero of the story, but rather how did the network and the way you leverage the network enable you to be successful, is that it elicited, this very invisible social fabric that more successful people build and leverage over time. And so you would hear stories of somebody having an opportunity land in their lap. Rather than hunker down, they were much more likely to reach out to 1 or 2 or 3 areas of tangentially related expertise and just see, am I looking at this the right way? Are there other ways to frame this to solve a bigger problem, a more relevant problem? Importantly, they would always go a second step in those referrals. So they would reach out to somebody that they thought may have a perspective on it, and then they would ask that person, who do you think I should be talking to? And that second step is very often the one that gets you to the very network influencers in the group. So the people that are heavily connected, well regarded in a given group. You're going to pick up the phone and call somebody in another area, and you may or may not guess somebody that's influential. The person they recommend you to 90+% of the time are going to be key influencers in those groups. And so you start engaging people early stage that you also need later stage to support the effort. They were much more likely to engage the client or stakeholder or consumer of the output of what they were going to do much earlier in the process. They didn't try to develop a perfect plan and take it out. They got something roughly right and then engaged the consumer of that idea early so that they were getting thoughts and perspectives. They weren't then developing in isolation. They were also getting buy-in in a subtle way. Much more likely to find, obviously, the positive influencers, the people that may be energizers, but also what really struck me from an innovation standpoint is that they were thinking about and engaging the negative influencers much more readily and getting their perspectives built in. And again, same notion. They weren't trying to perfect an idea. They weren't trying to rely on mandate or authority or just hoping that the negative influencers might go away, because every time you do that, the project you're trying to implement dies the death of a thousand cuts. They were much more pragmatic about identifying them, engaging them, getting their ideas built in, but of course, again, getting them committed to the effort. And so as we go through this, what you tend to see is the people that are winning from an innovation standpoint, they're doing these invisible things behind the scenes. There's very few organizations that have the analytics in place that help to see this, but everybody intuitively knows the network matters. What we've been able to start to add to that is specific kinds of interactions at specific points that have a greater impact. And what we see is that if you make these kind of investments over time, you tend to build a network that looks a little bit more like Kevin Bacon's than say Jim Carrey's. And the Kevin Bacon game is something that I'll always use to give people a sense of what I mean when I'm talking about a structurally diverse network. It's not a big network that matters, but it's one that has more of these bridging ties into other sub-pockets of expertise that has the big effect. So when I say a structurally diverse network, I don't even necessarily mean are you getting to people that look differently than you, but are you getting into and integrating different pockets of expertise in unique ways? And what we find is there's a website that I won't take people live to here called, it's at the bottom if you want to kind of go down and play with this, called the Oracle of Bacon. You can enter in names of actors or actresses and see how far away they are from Kevin Bacon. And it's pretty hard to get more than 3 steps removed from Kevin Bacon in the movie universe, not because of the number of movies he's been in. He has other contemporary actors and actresses that have been in similar numbers of movies. It's the diversity of the genres that makes him interesting. So whereas, say, a Jim Carrey has focused mainly in one domain around comedy, you might throw drama down there if we wanted to. Kevin's been in comedy, family, action, dramas, and it's that diversity of the genres or those sub-pockets that he reaches into that puts him at the more influential point in the network. When I say somebody's network that's more insular, I'm more focused around people like Jim's, where the people that he is connected with are themselves connected around them. So they're going to the same meetings, they're reading the same emails, they're focused on the same kinds of content or projects a lot. It's never perfect like this, but we can quantify each of these positions. And what we know is the people that maintain more structurally diverse networks like Kevin's tend to much greater likelihood of become and stay a high performer over time. The people that allow their network to be dictated to them, and this is, in part the real importance of the prior webinar we did on reducing collaborative overload, they tend to falter. And they may not get fired, but they tend to be much more likely to produce more narrow solutions. They tend to suffer attrition around them, lower engagement scores as they progress, and they tend to fall off the upwardly mobile category. So we know that matters from principle one. The people that drive innovation have a much greater tendency to be more dynamically building and leveraging these broad networks, early stage problem solving. And a couple of the toolkits are the lesson plans that you'll see in the handout that we have for you go into more detail around that. It talks about very specifically what kinds of connections tend to distinguish people over time, very specifically what people are doing to supplement skill gaps and transition and other, very tactical items like that. Where I wanted to dive down a little bit more today on the innovation front is a slightly different track around this idea of creating pull or engagement. So one of the things that I mentioned we've seen over and over again is this idea of, people that are energizers win consistently over time. And what we would find, though, as we went out and interviewed the energizers, is that they're not winning as a product of just being happy people. You're just as likely to find an energizer that's low key as high key, people that are charismatic or more subtle in how they approach things. But the reason that they tend to win is that they create pull or engagement around them. They tend to be much more likely to benefit by opportunities flowing to them, much more likely to attract better talent. You see over time the energizers become high performers, and then the people around them are more likely to be high performers because people have the ability to jockey for who they work for, and you're much more likely to move in the direction of somebody that creates a context of engagement around you. And we would see this also matter from a performance standpoint in all the projects that we were discussing, I was discussing with these leaders over the 160 interviews we ran, is that invariably every single project had 1, 2, 3, even 4 sometimes critical pivot points that were defined by a serendipitous encounter. Somebody bumped into somebody by an elevator, came across somebody in LinkedIn, any number of very kind of serendipitous encounters that they capitalized on, went in the direction that that individual suggested, and it turned out to be a pivotal moment in the project. We forget about this because of our own cognitive limitations. We tell ourselves stories that put ourselves at the center of the narrative of success, but oftentimes there were very significant points where both serendipitous encounters happened or where things were flowing to the individual. Recommendations came their way, opportunities came their way, talent flowed their way, people made suggestions that really turned out to be critical points in the success of the project. So at the absolute heart of it, and again, we tend to tell ourselves stories that forget these things that flow to us. We tend to undercount that and overemphasize what we did and recall ways of, what we did to make things successful. But one of the reasons that the energizers win, or the people that create this context of pull, is enormous benefits flow to them over time. And they get the benefit of getting better talent, better ideas, better resources around them. And it has a really significant impact on their success over time. And so the way we've been focusing on that, again, is that the energizers are not just winning because they're happy people, or just because they're cheerleaders. In fact, you're just as likely to see an energizer disagree as agree in the context of a plan or a project. Rather, the energizers tend to be people that create a set of layers and relationships around them. And in particular, leaders that are more successful first tend to create this foundation of trust, that others are willing to take a leap and get engaged in what you're up to. They trust that you as a leader are competent to come through on what you're saying, that you're benevolent in the sense that you're looking out for other people's interests, that you have integrity-based trust in the sense that you're going to come through on commitments. Without that, and everybody knows it, every time you're in an interaction, no matter how charismatic somebody is, if you sense that they're in it for themselves, then you're not going to take that step and get invested. If you are worried about the psychological safety of an interaction, you're not going to take a step that allows you to get energized, allows you to be fully present, allows you to bring your best self forward. But beyond trust and psychological safety, what we're also finding in here is that the leaders that are more effective engage in ways that create a sense of purpose in the work. Now, purpose is, going like crazy out there. Everybody says, I want to engage in work that has purpose. What I've been finding more and more is it's actually the nature of the interactions around the work that create that context of purpose. So as an example, I won't mention names of the companies here, but of the 20 companies, I had organizations where I was interviewing that, literally cured cancer and built infrastructure, in developing countries and fed the poor and had truly noble missions. And then I had one organization that made perhaps the most mundane product out there, and I'm not going to mention names or what it was. But what floored me is the organization that made the mundane project, from top to bottom, I interviewed more than the 8 there because it was amazing to me. These people were fired up. They were sure they were changing the world. And I would laugh with some of the leaders going, this is crazy. They're not, they make product X, not curing cancer, not feeding the hungry. And the leaders would laugh and say, don't tell them, right? But what they had done around the work was create a context where they started always with the why before the what and the how. They diffused ownership early. They created opportunities for people to engage in things that they aspired to early. There was a whole set of things that the leaders did that created this purpose-fueled culture and context. In contrast, the organization that fed the poor and another organization that was curing cancer, you could not find more bitter places. I mean, they were truly noble missions, truly worthwhile missions, but the collaborative tissue in those places had devolved into being about the individuals, why they weren't getting budget, why they weren't getting enough. So it's a really important substrate that a lot of times we're not focusing on enough, is the people that tend to be outperforming. They tend to build trust. They build this foundation, and it's been talked a tremendous amount with Amy Edmondson's work and others around psychological safety and other components of trust. But that's just a starting point, right? You go beyond that and you factor in ways those leaders are interacting and creating a context that enables people to get a sense that what they do matters. And then on top of that, the people that engage in a couple of practices in the moment that generate energy. They see possibilities, they use self-deprecating humor, they enable room for others to contribute, tend to be the ones that benefit over time. They tend to get greater impact from individuals in the moment, and they tend to be much more likely to get greater engagement, get greater effort from individuals around them, and they win. So when I'm emphasizing this idea of engagement through networks, it's not what is the individual leader getting from others, right? And how do they manage in their own connectivity so they thrive? It's rather, what are they doing that creates this context of trust, purpose, and energy so that others thrive in the network? And that's the orientation of this lesson and some of the tools that we're going to put out there. And we'll start with the first foundation on trust. And when we look at this, there are three forms of trust that we know matter. And I'm just about to lead you into this poll, so I want you to get ready for me here. First is around competence-based trust. So this very specifically is geared to the notion that you create a context where others trust that you can do what you say you can do. And that it's not so much about, do I trust you in the sense of benevolence or other items, but it's very much around, can you tactically execute on what you're doing? Are you doing things that form this dimension of trust quickly rather than, taking 3 to 5 years for people to see you and observe you? Two is around benevolence, and this is the notion of, do other people trust that you care about them to some level? You have their interests in mind. And three is the notion of integrity, that you're consistent between word and deed. And so what we've done in this, through all the interviews, is not go out and ask people, do you trust this individual, but rather, what are the behaviors that lead to this form of trust? And when we take that slice at it, it gives a very different perspective around the specific behaviors that enable people to cultivate, these forms of trust, and especially do it a little bit more rapidly, especially today where people are put on teams very quickly and don't have as much time to cultivate trust over time, because they may be on teams for shorter periods of time, and half the time they're on 3, 4, 5 teams, and it just takes time for this fabric to develop. So I'm going to turn this over to the poll, and what I would love to do is just get everybody to engage with us for a second and reflect for a moment on one behavior that, if your leaders exhibited more systematically in your organization, could create a foundation of trust. And I know these are slightly longer items and take a little bit longer to process, so we're going to give a little bit more time here for people to rate on. But take just a moment here and look down here and rate as you can.
All right. So as people are wrapping up here, I'll ask Feng to leave this open for just a moment here and tell you a little bit of a story around this. We have built this out in a diagnostic in a way that I want to show people, so you know the email that you'll get in a little bit. But we've also, for the research group, built out these card sort activities where we know there's 27 behaviors that we're focused on, and they're organized into things that leaders do that create a sense of trust, things that leaders do that create a sense of purpose, and things that leaders do that create a sense of energy, right? And so these are the trust items. And so the last consortium meeting that I ran for my group, I had taken them down to MIT Media Lab, and then we were going to go out to see the Freedom Trail and Paul Revere, because Paul Revere is a great networker. The reason he was successful over Dawes was because Paul spent a lot of time in bars and had a very diverse network. But right as we're in the MIT Media Lab, the rain just comes down pouring like crazy. And so we ended up having to shuttle all 200 people back to Babson. And I said, since we can't go do this walk, let's take these cards and just get your hands around something that you have access to and can use with your leaders. And I said, I want you to take the card sort activity and organize a pile into trust, the activities into trust, a pile into purpose, the behaviors that create purpose, and a pile of energy, right? The behaviors that create energy. And then I told all 200 people, I want you to pull one card out from any stack you want. And, you read, here's the dimension, here's why it matters, here's what you can do about it. And the cool thing about it is you turn the cards over and they have these QR codes that you hover your phone over, and it opens up a lesson plan and lets you kind of go in and interact with building out, a set of activities you need to go do. So it's kind of high tech, low tech. And I wanted people to get their hands on it. But here was the funny thing, is I just on a whim, I said, of the 200 people in this room, show of hands, how many people picked the energy one? And about 48% of the hands went up. Energy stack. And then I said, okay, how many people picked the purpose stack? Picked a card out of the purpose stack. Again, about 48% of the hands went up. And I just kind of chuckled and I said, did anybody pick the trust stack? And, one lonely hand in the back of the room went up. But it hit me like a ton of bricks at that point in time, is that, trust, and especially exhibiting the behaviors that underlie it, is an incredible blind spot for probably most of us. We trust our own intentions, and we don't oftentimes probably think about the signals that we are unintentionally sending or behaviors that we're engaging in that may undermine people's trust in us. So if I take, for example, just the one that's highlighted here, doing what you say you're going to do and following through on commitments they make to people in their network, one of the things that we consistently see, this is the lower 25%, not the upper 25%, one of the things we consistently see with leaders is that they don't set expectations well. They leave rooms or they leave meetings believing that they've committed to doing, a certain level of result, and then they misalign with followers. And that gap in expectation starts to erode trust, right? And in a very unnecessary way, right? When we see that leaders go through the diagnostic and they have this item flagged in different ways, they start focusing on just a few, more systematic ways of setting and managing expectations, and then making sure that they're committing against them to ensure that they don't create this unnecessary erosion of trust around them. The other one, create rich interaction points. I'll give you just one very specific example. As I went through all these interviews, one of the leaders I spoke with was an alternate on the Olympic wrestling team, and he's a big, burly guy. And he sat down with me and he said, one of the things I always do is I start every group I move into at some point in the first couple of months, is I try to talk through this diagnostic dimensions of difference with them. And it's just a very kind of soft and feely, diagnostic that organizes ideas around values and orientations and where people are coming from. And he said, the reason I do that is so people have a sense of who I am and that I can get a better sense of who they are. And he said it has an amazing effect because his words exactly, where there's so many opportunities for people to misinterpret my actions, that if they don't have a sense of where I'm coming from, then trust erodes very quickly. And so you get a sense of when these leaders are more effective, they're actually doing things that are intentionally focused on these components of trust, and not from the broad standpoint of, is this a safe context or do people trust each other, but from a little bit of a layer down around, are there certain behaviors that we need to be more consistent on? Okay, Sang, if I can have it back here, I will kind of take us forward and move into to also show the diagnostic. Thank you very much. And, one of the things you can do coming out of this is you'll get an email that enables you to take a short assessment, and you can use this with your leaders. This is something we've made available for the Commons members in different ways, but it'll give people 27 items, and they can come in and say, there's a set around trust, there's a set around purpose, there's a set around energy. They take it 5 to 8 minutes roughly. They will get something back immediately that looks like this. And so we'll get a website that says, here's how you're doing on the dimensions that create trust. And again, for trust, we're interested in 3 dimensions: competence, benevolence, and integrity. For purpose, we're interested in a different set of dimensions that are around, do you as an individual create a context that enables others to find purpose in their work? It's not, are you getting purpose, or is the work generating purpose, but rather, do you create a context where others can find purpose? And then do you create a context where others are energized, right, in their work? And what you'll get is take it and you'll get an immediate profile that may show, okay, based on your self-perception, here's how I think I do on these things that matter. If you choose to invite raters in, and raters do not to me mean a 360. Really what I'm interested in here, who are the people, not your boss or your client. I'm much more interested in the people that observe how you collaborate. And so I'll find a lot of times, for example, people will put their spouse in or others. It doesn't have to be, the typical way you're thinking about a 360. But if you include that, you can get a second bar that says, here's how I stack up against my raters, and it can show you, positive gaps and maybe blind spots where raters, you think you're doing better than your raters per se. And you can also invite your team in to take it. And if you bring your team in, then it actually generates a different profile that's focused on how are we doing as a team, different level report that enables you as a leader to go back to your team and discuss, here are one or two things that maybe we can improve, right? And so a lot of the members of the research group that I run, they get a lot of traction out of this and being able to give things back to their leaders that they are not just learning from themselves, but then taking back into action through their teams. And that isolates out, different content areas. So if we just look at the blind spot for this individual, are they doing things sufficiently that gives before asking for help? This is a fundamental trait in humans that we know reciprocity gets built, and people's belief in benevolence gets built if you're giving first, and it has a really big impact. And so it kind of clamshells down, and you can hone in on what you should be doing differently to have impact on that front. So I just want to make sure people, had a context of what we will be sharing after the session. There'll be an email that goes out, and you'll get a focus on the tool sets, the lesson plans, but you'll also have the chance to go in and take the assessment or share it with others as another way for us to kind of get the ideas out and get people working with them in different ways. So first piece in here was trust, and, in essence, creating a foundation that is really just a baseline condition for me. And every organization I'm in, the sad part is this is what they're very worried about right now, is that people don't trust each other. They don't feel psychologically safe. And that, to me, if you go back to Hertzberg or others, it's just a hygiene condition, right? It's not that you build trust and suddenly great things are going to flourish. That's just a hygiene condition. It's got to be there for things to become a motivator. What I'm seeing is that the next step for leaders that do better is they engage in a way that creates a context of purpose for others around them. And so we've actually gone out and mapped that in a lot of organizations. We'll craft these, and same thing with trust. I've mapped these ideas of benevolence trust, confidence trust, integrity-based trust. We show that it is incredibly predictive of where innovation's happening, incredibly predictive of what high performers do. In other work, we spent a lot of times focusing on this idea of purpose. And the question in these network assessments is, when you interact with this individual, do you walk away feeling like what you do matters? And do you feel like you're having impact in what you're up to? Do you have a sense of purpose in your work? And this was a group of top leaders within a major professional services organization. And we were focused in different ways around how to drive revenue production and other kind of pragmatic aspects of the network analysis as well. In those cases, we're actually mapping, who has interacted with whom and gone to market together. But what I've stopped at the very end of the session on is I said, let me show you one more thing. And this is the network of purpose in this organization. And this was an organization that had creating purposeful work as a core component of their culture, of what they were up to. And I said, let me show you how you guys as leaders create it between each other. And I pulled the whole network diagram up, had it all blue, and then I turned on the oranges here, and I said, these are your top leaders in this group. And I said, the interesting thing is some of them do it pretty well. The oranges in the center of the network tend to be people that create a context of purpose for others. So others find purpose in their work by virtue of how that leader's leading. But then I pointed out to the edge, and I said, some of you guys are horrendous at it. And, it actually ranged that the top quartile leaders created a context of purpose for almost 16 others, 15.8 others in the diagram. But then it dropped down dramatically, until you get to the bottom quartile leaders that, didn't even get to one person on average, right? And yet the top quartile leaders, they attracted higher performers. They had lower attrition rates around them. The engagement scores around them were greater. But all of this was invisible, right? And so I, again, kind of split the room. And I said, let's just think about this for a second. Last time you had, a sense of purpose in your work, you were showing up fully there. What was it that was going on? It's not mysticism or doing yoga in the hallway or, having Friday happy hours. What was it about the interactions that were leading you to feel like you had impact? And you get, fairly consistent things, right? You find that the leaders that create purpose clarify and align work with career objectives in mind. So let me be really specific there. We find the leaders that do this better, they're much more likely to have systematic one-on-ones with their employees that they hold to religiously, where about 50% of the time is off task. And it's not just pure project updates, but what are these people's aspirations? What are they trying to accomplish? And how can that individual help them get there? And there's never a perfect alignment, but by virtue of doing that, those leaders, as work comes in, they have a much greater likelihood of allocating things back out to people in a better way, of morphing work in a way that aligns with what people care about. And they get a better sense of purpose from others. Much more likely to help these people build professional networks outside of the group, right? Not the specific project or the specific function, but helping them connect with others that may be into communities of practice, innovation challenges, other areas where they could connect with people that shared similar values, pushed in a way that they wanted to. Leaders are much more likely to establish the why in the work before the what and the how, and spend time thinking about why are we doing this, what's the impact it's going to have, and co-create with the people versus delegate early. Now, to do this, and part of the reason we're staggering these webinars in the way we are, the collaboratively overloaded leaders, the core part of the prior webinar, they never have the time to do this, right? They're always coming in on the what and the how, and they don't have enough space built in to be able to engage others in a way that they're finding meaning. And you see it, they lose over time. Whereas these leaders, the leaders that create purpose, they have higher engagement scores, lower attrition rates, et cetera. The collaboratively overloaded leaders in this specific organization, the turnover rates were as high as 200% higher around the collaboratively overloaded people in certain tenure bands. So it's a kind of a critical, step process here of thinking about how do you delayer, and then how do you create a context that others find purpose-filled. And of course, I had the other side of the room then think about, okay, the times that you were just having the life ripped out of you in your career, what was it about the relationships that was there? Not the work again, but what was it about the relationship with the boss, the relationship with your colleagues, et cetera? And you get a whole set of things, right, that people resonate with and kind of make sense of. Being micromanaged, no latitude to influence the course of things, not feeling trusted, not feeling valued or supported by your leader or peers around you, seeing no future growth opportunities, not believing in leadership, or believing that there's lack of authenticity there, or lack of trust in that context. So you get the idea. None of this is magic per se, but it also isn't purely abstract and philosophical, in that the leaders that have a tendency to create this context of purpose, or this layer of purpose, tend to be doing things just a little bit differently. And it takes a little bit of time, but it has a much greater tendency to pay back over time by virtue of creating this context of greater engagement, greater followership around their efforts. So I thought we would try this one more time. Let me do one more poll here, saying if you can take this over again. And now that you guys are well-oiled machines in terms of the voting piece of this, we'll go ahead and poll again on one idea that you think could have the greatest impact in your organization, and then debrief on that a little bit, and then we'll wrap on the energy component. All right, we good. So it looks like the biggest impact in this case is focusing around the why before the tactics of accomplishing work. Really common, thing that I would hear over and over again in the interviews, and you could see it, systematically in terms of when we go out and interview people that score super high in terms of the purpose side of this as well. Easy to drop, right? And again, I can't emphasize the degree to which the webinars that we're doing here go hand in hand, right? It's the people that engage in those practices that buy back 18 to 24% of their collaborative time that have the capacity to to do some of these things that, take a little bit more time. But the people that do it really get, very systematically much greater engagement around them. Let me also pick one that didn't get so many votes. And I'm going to focus in, for example, on encourage fun and work. And I realize that especially for hard-bitten, people out there in many of your organizations, you may not want to frame it that way or pursue it that way. But it was amazing to me the number of stories I would hear, in really tough engineering contexts of a leader just deciding that they were going to organize a scavenger hunt, and the degree to which people were like little kids again, or in military contexts of how leaders would start off with a question of the day. And it would usually be, which superhero do you want to be? Or, something this kind of off task and lighthearted that people got engaged in, and they connected in a different way. Or leaders in a pharmaceutical company would focus around bringing in wow videos. So this is the marketing function. But videos that starting every meeting with a very heavy focus on some inspirational video somebody found on YouTube that was tangentially related to what they needed to talk about. And the impact is oftentimes surprising, right? You find if you can do things that take a little bit of risk, that, people, even the most hard-bitten ones, tend to really want to be connecting off task and engaging in things that are a little bit more lighthearted. Doesn't necessarily mean, going out to cocktails per se. In fact, I've very rarely heard that about, going out drinking together or being on the golf course. It's much more in the small, subtle moments that kind of let us be human, if you will, that I tended to see the greatest impact. And we will push ahead one last stretch here. So you get the idea, and I won't go back to the assessment, but the power of that assessment is, again, for people to be getting feedback, thinking about themselves. What are one or two things that I might want to go do? Not that you're going to go do all 27, but rather there are one or two things where either you as an individual recognize you need to do things differently, or you opt to choose in raters or even include your team in and get different feedback. And we find that people that create these more enriched, purpose-based networks, they tend to be doing some pretty specific things differently, right? And then the last cap on this, and you get the sense of what I'm progressing up, is it's first, you just create the hygiene conditions that people have trust, right, in you and in the context they're in. And then number two is, do they care, right? Have you created a context where people can see enough of a reason to engage that they are willing to show up, willing to bring themselves a little bit more? And then the last is, do you do things in the moment that generate this sense of energy, right? And that people see possibilities, they see how they're going to have impact, they get enthused and have a much greater tendency to bring their best. And this idea, very specifically on the energy front, is something that I started focusing on literally 20 years ago, and have kind of over time refined how we're looking at it, understanding what creates it, what sustains it. But this was a very, very well-known professional services organization I was working within. One of the very first places we did studies around what high performers do. And I had been in that organization, which if I mentioned the name of it, everybody would go, got it. But imagine, one of your blue chip professional services firms that everybody wants to work for, and you'd be in the category. And I'd been there and set up just the Cadillac of all surveys, designed to see what creates a high performer in this context. And we were really focused on, is it things about that individual, how smart they are, their credentials, schooling, whatever it may be? Was it things about the way they tapped resources around them and leveraged technology, or was it their network in different ways that tended to generate the ability to get and stay in the upwardly mobile performance category? And what we learned in that is that you could land in the bottom quartile if you weren't smart enough or using the resources around you. But what got and kept you in that upward quartile was this, number one, this idea of a broad, structurally diverse network, one that you tended to source for different ideas, to see possibilities differently. But what I'll never forget is the energy piece of this. So I was walking down the hall of this very well-known organization, and one of the senior partners stopped right in front of me and, said words I'll never forget in a very kind of authoritarian way. He said, "Rob, we're all smart here." And there's a slight arrogance associated with this organization. So I kind of, just nodded my head at first. And And he paused, and I recognized that that was my prompt to tell them how smart they were, which I did. We kind of got by the awkwardness of that. But then he said something I'll never forget. He said, we get great talent here. And he said, I don't think it's people that have a couple of points of IQ, higher intelligence, or are a little bit more analytically crisp that win the day. And I tease them a lot, but they do. They get amazing people in this organization, very hard to get into, not just in terms of intelligence, but in terms of worldview, breadth of what these people have done. It is an amazing group. The basic thing he was saying is, I don't think it's somebody that's slightly smarter. I think it's people that create buzz or energy around them. And he said, can we map this? Can we go out and map, when people interact with other people, who are the people that you walk away from feeling like you're more enthused about what you're up to in this organization? And then in this context, they let us map the negative side. Who are the people that just suck the life out of you? Now, right now, I'm just showing you one very highly disguised network of the positive side. I used to show the negative side, but all the arrows went to the partners and they didn't think it was that funny. So I'm only allowed to show the positive dimension here. But what you get is a view, just like we showed of purpose, a view of energy or enthusiasm, right? Not just the people that create a context that you matter, but that you get enthused and are kind of engaged. And you actually see a really similar profile, right? You have some leaders very good at building this context, and then you drift out to the far right, and you see somebody, for example, like a UA in blue. Level 4 was the higher disguised hierarchical level. That he himself managed to energize absolutely nobody. There's no arrows coming into him. He was only energized by 2 other leaders. So again, we've literally seen this for 20 years as we play with these ideas in different configurations, that there is typically a quartile in the organization that's doing it well and they're invisibly benefiting. And then, another set that is slowly eroding, right, in different ways. And when we threw in the energy dimension into the regression models, we found that it was a huge predictor of what more successful people did, and turned out statistically in that organization to be about 4 times the predictor of a more successful person. And it is anything else, that 4 times the predictor of the structurally open network early stage. And that's held for about 20 years, 300 organizations. We consistently see that if you do these things that lead to energy, then you're much more likely to do better. And it makes a lot of sense, just intuitively. Energizers get more from those around them in terms of discretionary effort. People tend to be more innovative and creative with energizers, and the solutions they generate in team sessions is greater. Energizers tend to win out in the internal labor market, in the sense that not only are the energizers more likely to be high performers, but we also find that the people that they attract are more likely to be high performers. And so they have a much greater ability to create a multiplier effect. They generate work satisfaction and learning, much more likely to drive change more effectively than people that don't do this. And it's also very behavioral. If we had a little bit more time and we were live in a moment, I would ask people to reflect on what do energizers do? Split the room, have one half of the room talk about energizers, the other half talk about de-energizers. And you always hear very consistent traits. It's not that they're charismatic. You're as likely to see a low-key person be an energizer as a high-key person. It's not that they agree all the time. You're as likely to see an energizer disagree as agree. The way they do it's different. They don't say that's a bad idea. They separate the idea from the person and expose their own thinking. So they'll say, given where we're trying to go, here's an alternative. But it's not, just people that celebrate everything. Rather, you see they have a tendency to stand for something larger than themselves. They disagree with the idea, not the person. They use humor, and usually self-deprecating humor, to take status out, fully present and engaged in conversations. So not just are they there, but do they turn text off, right? Or kind of keep fully present at that level. Tends to index the importance of others. They see opportunities that connect with what others care about and not just their own interest, and they connect off task in a way that creates and inspires people to believe that that individual cares, for something a little bit more broad than them. Now, the energizers do the reverse, right? The de-energizers. I'm sorry. So we've, mapped the idea of de-energizers or fear for years as well. You tend to see a very consistent set of characteristics there too. They see roadblocks or have criticisms. They don't create opportunities for others to be valued, inflexible, don't show concern for others around them, don't come through on commitments. and then have a natural tendency a lot of times to just get louder when people don't listen, rather than back away and say, why are people not embracing an idea? They have an unfortunate tendency to try and persist with force and not put an idea in front of people in a way that creates followership to it, but to continue to try and win through logic or kind of dominance or argumentative style. And they lose over time. You find that, very systematically, when we've analyzed these results, the energizers are always, statistically much more likely to become and stay high performers over time. The de-energizers much more likely to leave an organization or to fall out of the upwardly mobile category. And the interesting thing to me is that they're very much made and not born. So I'd always believe myself that as we've gone through this for years and years and years, the de-energizers, that was just how God put them on the earth, right? And there's not, a whole amount that can be done about it. When somebody from Harvard came and had a real interest in this, we have by far the biggest data set on this stuff out there. And so she was mining the results to see, when companies have, for example, included this with their engagement surveys, we have year after year results to see, did de-energizers in, say, time period 10 start that way, right? And 90+% of the time, we found that the de-energizers at time period 10 didn't start that way. If you back up to, say, time period 2 or 3 or 4, they actually were, neutral or actually energizers. And so what I'm completely convinced of is that usually it's a failure not handled well, right? It's some opportunity where leaders have not enabled people to regroup. And at some point, it just flat out doesn't matter what the de-energizer tries to do to correct the situation. The network itself is so intrinsically, reinforcing the perception of the person that it doesn't really have a big impact. So again, if we cap this and we think about what do the energizers do at the tip of the iceberg, they tend to see possibilities, realistic possibilities. They stay fully attentive. They create space for others to be meaningful parts of the conversation, use humor, and have a greater tendency to maintain an effective balance between pushing toward a goal and welcoming others' input. None of this is earth-shattering, but what I oftentimes find is that the leaders that falter, the difference, let me say it this way, the difference between the leaders that are energizers, that kind of, hit the pinnacle, is that they do these things more systematically. So the specific, notion is when you're under stress or pressure, which one or two of these do you do less systematically than you should? Not do you do these or not, but rather, in those conditions, what do you tend to let slip and fall? And again, you can put these items in front of a group and get them to think about it. You can use the diagnostic and have leaders reflect and get peer-based feedback on where they might need to see improvement. But the notion for me ultimately, and I'll in 2 minutes and in 30 seconds turn it over to you, Mike, here, is that the people that do this well, they're creating, in essence, a sense of a context that creates much greater engagement, right? And it's not just energy, or it's not just purpose in the work. It's a platform that gets built where people trust in the individual, then they have enough interaction to create a sense of purpose or meaning in what they're doing, and then they engage in a way that generates energy. And that tends to be, the result for that drives innovation in unique ways, yields performance, yields greater engagement. Studies we repeatedly do on measuring attrition, do the network analytics, and then see who's more likely to stay or leave on a month-to-month basis, shows that that's a huge benefit of the people that engage in these practices. They're much more likely to keep key talent over time, and the engagement scores of those individuals are much higher. All is a product not of the leaders thinking about what they need from the network, but do they create a context where others thrive? All right. So, Mike, let me turn it over to you to see if there are any open questions out there and to take us home, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great, Rob. Thank you so much for this today. This was incredibly insightful. And as I hope people agree with me, the translation of the research into, from theory to practice, if you will, is very, very strong with the work that Rob does. And I think the stuff that's online through the Connected Commons and these assessments that Rob's put together and put out there for people to use for free are amazing, and everyone should tap into that, because this is, I think, some of the best work around personal team organizational effectiveness that we've seen in decades. So thanks so much again, Rob, and thank you to IRC for HR for partnering with Rob and bringing all of this forward in a way that can be consumed by the broader marketplace. And again, want to thank everybody for being on the call today. And Rob, we look forward to series number 3 in a month or so, and we'll get information back out to people on that.